The Colorado blizzard had been raging for 3 days, turning the mountain wilderness into a white hell that could kill even the strongest man in hours. But Sarah Whitman wasn't a strong man. She was a 24-year-old widow who had given birth alone in an abandoned mining cabin with nothing but torn fabric for bandages and melted snow for water. Now, as she stumbled through knee-deep drifts with her newborn son pressed against her chest, Sarah knew she was going to die. The baby's cries had grown weaker with each passing hour, and her own strength was nearly gone. Her white dress, already stained with blood from the difficult birth, hung in frozen tatters that provided no protection against the killing cold. What Sarah didn't know was that she wasn't alone in these mountains. For the past week, Jack Raven Morrison had been hiding in these same peaks, nursing wounds from his last job gone wrong, and trying to decide whether to keep running or finally turn himself in to the territorial marshals. 8 years as one of the most wanted outlaws in Colorado territory had taught him to survive anything the wilderness could throw at him. But it hadn't prepared him for the sight of a half-frozen woman collapsing in the snow with a baby in her arms. Jack had been tracking what he thought was a wounded deer when he spotted the footprints in the snow. Small, stumbling steps that spoke of desperation rather than purpose. He'd followed the trail more out of curiosity than compassion, his hand resting on the Colt .45 that had made him legendary among the criminal fraternity of the American West. But when he crested the ridge and saw Sarah fall to her knees in the snow, something shifted inside the hardened outlaw's chest. She wasn't moving anymore. The baby had stopped crying. In the howling wind and swirling snow, they looked like two ghosts who had already crossed over to whatever came next. Jack could have turned away, should have turned away. Getting involved with desperate people was how outlaws ended up at the end of a rope, and he had enough problems of his own. Instead, he found himself sliding down the snowy slope toward them, his boots crunching in the deep powder as he approached the woman who was about to change his life forever. Sarah's eyes fluttered open as a shadow fell across her face, and she looked up to see a tall man in a dark coat standing over her, like death itself. His face was weathered by years of hard living, his black hat covered in snow, and there was a gun on his hip that spoke of violence and danger. But his eyes held something she hadn't expected to see in the face of a stranger in the wilderness. Compassion. "Ma'am," Jack said, quietly, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "You're in a bad way here." Sarah tried to speak, but her lips were too numb to form words. She could only clutch her baby tighter and wait to see if this stranger was her salvation or just another way to die in the Colorado mountains. Jack knelt beside them in the snow, his experienced gaze taking in the woman's condition with the same efficiency he'd once used to assess targets and escape routes. She was hypothermic, exhausted and bleeding, but alive. The baby was breathing, which was more than he'd dared to hope. "Well, little one," he murmured to the infant, "looks like you and your mama just changed an outlaw's plans." Without another word, Jack Morrison, wanted for armed robbery, cattle rustling, and killing 3 men in fair fights, gathered up a strange woman and her newborn child and carried them toward the cave where he'd been hiding from the law. He had no idea he was about to discover that sometimes running from your past means running straight into your future. The cave Jack Morrison had been calling home for the past week wasn't much to look at. A narrow opening in the rock face that led to a chamber barely large enough for 2 people. But it was dry, hidden from the wind, and had a natural chimney that allowed him to keep a small fire burning without the smoke giving away his position to any law enforcement that might be tracking him through these mountains. As he carried Sarah and her baby inside, Jack realized his outlaw hideout was about to become something he'd never expected. A place where life was saved instead of taken. Sarah hadn't spoken during the treacherous climb to the cave, but Jack could feel her watching him with the wary alertness of someone who knew she had no choice but to trust a dangerous stranger. Her baby had stopped crying, which worried him more than if the child had been screaming. In his experience, silence usually meant something was dying. "Easy now," Jack murmured as he set them down near his small fire, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe here. Nobody knows about this place but me." Sarah tried to sit up straighter, her arms tightening protectively around her son. Even half frozen and exhausted, Her maternal instincts were sharp as a blade. Who, who are you? She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside the cave entrance. Jack paused, his hands hovering over the supplies he'd been gathering. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. He could lie, tell her he was a prospector or a trapper, someone safe and respectable. But looking at this woman who'd nearly died bringing life into the world, Jack found he didn't have the stomach for deception. "Name's Jack Morrison," he said simply, pulling a wool blanket from his bedroll. "And before you ask, yes, I'm probably the man your husband warned you about when he said not to trust strangers in these mountains." Sarah's eyes widened with fear, but she didn't try to run. Smart woman, she knew she wouldn't make it 10 yards in her condition. You're an outlaw, among other things." Jack wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, his movements careful and non-threatening. "But right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and freezing to death. So maybe we can discuss my criminal record after I get some warm food in you." The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, letting out a weak cry that tore at something deep in Jack's chest. He'd never been around infants. His life hadn't exactly been conducive to family gatherings. But even he could tell this child needed help. "He's so cold," Sarah whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I don't know how to. I've tried everything, but he won't stop shivering." Jack stared at the tiny bundle in her arms, feeling more helpless than he had since his first bank robbery 8 years ago. He could outdraw any gunfighter west of the Mississippi, track a man across 50 miles of wilderness, and survive for weeks on nothing but jerky and rainwater. But a crying baby might as well have been a loaded cannon for all he knew about handling it. "What's his name?" Jack asked, crouching beside them. "Samuel," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "After his father." "Where's his father now?" Sarah's face crumpled. "Buried in the Redemption Creek Cemetery. Fever took him 3 weeks before Samuel was born." She looked up at Jack with eyes full of pain that had nothing to do with the cold. "I was trying to get to my sister in Denver when the storm hit. Got lost in the mountains, found that old mining cabin, and then—" She gestured helplessly at her torn dress, her exhausted state. Jack felt something twist in his gut, a combination of sympathy and rage at a world that would leave a pregnant woman to fend for herself. "You gave birth alone? In that cabin?" Didn't have much choice in the matter. Sarah's voice carried a strength that surprised him. Despite everything she'd endured, there was steel in this woman. Samuel decided he couldn't wait for proper medical attention. Jack reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small bottle of whiskey, part of his meager supplies, but something told him Sarah needed it more than he did. "Drink this." "Not much, just enough to warm you from the inside." Sarah hesitated. "I shouldn't." "I'm feeding him, and—" "Ma'am, with respect, your baby needs his mama alive more than he needs you following proper etiquette." Jack's voice was firm but kind. "A sip of whiskey isn't going to hurt either of you, and it might keep you from losing fingers to frostbite." As Sarah took a careful sip, Jack began organizing his limited supplies with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making do with less. He had enough food for maybe another week if he rationed carefully. Jerky, hardtack, a small bag of coffee beans, and some canned peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion. Looking at Sarah's gaunt face and the baby's weak movements, Jack figured this qualified. "Why are you helping us?" Sarah asked suddenly, watching him work. "I mean, you said yourself you're an outlaw. Why risk your hiding place for strangers?" Jack paused, a can of peaches in his hand. It was a fair question, and one he wasn't sure he could answer honestly because he wasn't entirely sure himself. "Maybe I'm tired of being the kind of man who walks away from people in trouble. And maybe you're lying to make me feel safer." Jack looked at her with surprise and a grudging respect. "Maybe I am. Does it matter right now?" Sarah considered this, her fingers gently stroking her baby's head. "I suppose not. Right now, I'll take help from the devil himself if it means Samuel lives through the night." "Well, I'm not quite the devil," Jack said, with something that might have been a smile, "but I've shaken hands with him a time or two." As the evening wore on, Jack found himself doing things he'd never imagined, heating water in his tin cup to help Sarah clean herself up, sharing his blankets without thought of his own comfort, even holding little Samuel, while Sarah tended to her own needs with the privacy the cave's shadows could provide. The baby was so small, so fragile in his calloused hands that had spilled blood and stolen gold. But Samuel looked up at him with unfocused eyes that held no judgment, no knowledge of the wanted posters, with Jack's face scattered across half the territory. To this child, Jack Morrison wasn't an outlaw. He was just the man keeping him warm while his mother recovered from bringing him into the world. "He likes you," Sarah observed as she settled back against the cave wall, looking marginally better after some food and warmth. "Babies don't have much sense," Jack replied, but his voice was softer than usual. "Give him a few years and he'll know better than to trust men like me." "Men like you?" Sarah studied his face in the firelight. "What kind of man saves a stranger's life and then says she shouldn't trust him?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the small fire. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cave, something unexpected was taking root, a sense of peace he'd forgotten existed. "The kind of man who spent 8 years taking what doesn't belong to him," he said finally. "The kind who's got a price on his head and enemies in every town from here to California. The kind your husband probably told you to shoot on sight if you ever met one in a dark alley." Sarah was quiet, processing this. "And yet here you are, risking your life to save mine." "Here I am," Jack agreed, gently rocking Samuel as the baby finally began to settle into sleep. "Maybe," Sarah said quietly, "you're not the kind of man you think you are." Jack looked at her then, this brave, strong woman who'd survived more in the past week than most people faced in a lifetime, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 8 years was starting to thaw, and he wasn't sure if that was salvation or the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. But as he watched Sarah's eyes drift closed and felt the tiny weight of Samuel in his arms, Jack Morrison realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside the cave, the storm raged on, but inside, 3 unlikely souls had found shelter in more ways than one. Dawn came gray and muted, the blizzard finally showing signs of weakening after 4 days of relentless fury. Jack had spent most of the night awake, listening to the wind and watching over Sarah and Samuel as they slept. He'd told himself he was being practical, keeping watch for trouble, maintaining the fire, ensuring his unexpected guests survived until the weather cleared. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He couldn't stop looking at them. Sarah had curled up against the cave wall with Samuel nestled against her chest, both of them peaceful in sleep despite everything they'd endured. In the soft glow of the dying fire, she looked younger than her 24 years, vulnerable in a way that made Jack's protective instincts flare like nothing ever had before. It was a feeling that scared him more than any sheriff's posse ever could. "You didn't sleep," Sarah said softly, her eyes opening to find Jack crouched by the fire, adding another piece of wood to the coals. "Somebody had to keep watch," Jack replied, not meeting her gaze. "These mountains are full of things that'll kill you in your sleep. Weather, animals, men worse than me." Sarah sat up carefully, checking on Samuel before looking around the cave with new eyes. In daylight, she could see details that the darkness had hidden: a neat arrangement of supplies, weapons cleaned and ready, even a small stack of books tucked into a natural shelf in the rock wall. "You read?" she asked, surprised. Jack followed her gaze and shrugged. "Gets lonely up here. Found those in an abandoned cabin last month. Figured they were better company than talking to myself." "What kind of books does an outlaw read?" "Shakespeare mostly, some poetry, a book about astronomy." Jack's voice carried a hint of defensiveness. "Just because a man's outside the law doesn't mean he's outside civilization entirely." Sarah studied him with new interest. This wasn't the kind of criminal she'd been warned about: rough, uneducated men who solved problems with violence and lived like animals. Jack Morrison was clearly dangerous, but he was also complex in ways that intrigued her, despite her better judgment. "How does someone who reads Shakespeare end up robbing banks?" she asked gently. Jack was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were telling someone else's story. "Started during the war. I was 17 when I enlisted with the Colorado Territory Volunteers. Thought I was going to be a hero fighting for the Union cause. Jack poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up toward the cave's natural chimney. Turned out war wasn't much about heroism. Mostly it was about killing boys who looked just like you and trying not to think too hard about why. Sarah remained silent, sensing this was a story Jack had never told anyone. After the war, I came home to find my family's ranch seized for back taxes. My parents were dead. Fever took them while I was off playing soldier. My younger sister. Jack's voice caught slightly. Mary was 14. She'd been working in a saloon in town, trying to keep food on the table while I was gone. Some things you can't come back from, even for family. What happened to her? Consumption got her that winter. Died in a charity hospital while I was out trying to find honest work. Jack's laugh was bitter. Turns out being good with a gun doesn't qualify you for much in peacetime, except maybe sheriff's work, and they weren't hiring ex-soldiers with attitudes. Sarah felt her heart ache for the young man he'd been, trying to do right in a world that seemed determined to punish him for it. So you turned to robbery, started small, stole enough to buy Mary medicine, food, a real doctor, but it was too late. She was already too far gone. Jack set down the stick and looked directly at Sarah. After she died, I figured if the world was going to treat me like a criminal anyway, might as well make it worth their while. And you've been running ever since. 8 years of it. Built up quite a reputation. Jack Raven Morrison and his gang. We hit banks, stagecoaches, railroad payrolls. Never killed anyone who didn't draw on us first. Never hurt women or children. Always left enough for folks to rebuild. Guess I thought that made us noble thieves instead of just thieves. Sarah was quiet, processing this. Outside, she could hear the wind starting to die down, which meant their time in this strange sanctuary was limited. Soon, Jack would have to decide what to do with his unexpected guests, and she would have to face the world again with a newborn and no resources. "What happened to your gang?" she asked. Jack's expression darkened. "Got ambitious. Started taking jobs from people who didn't share my principles about innocent folks. Last month, they wanted to hit a train carrying Army payroll, but also carrying soldiers' families heading to a new posting. Women and children, just like the ones I'd sworn never to hurt. You refused. I refused. They called me soft, said I'd lost my edge. We had words. Leads started flying. Jack touched his left shoulder unconsciously, and Sarah noticed the way he favored that arm. I was outnumbered 4-1, but I got lucky. They didn't. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. You killed your own men? They weren't my men anymore the moment they decided innocent people were acceptable losses. Jack's voice was hard as stone. I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, Sarah, but I draw the line at murder. What they were planning, that wasn't robbery, that was massacre. The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. Sarah looked at this man who'd saved her life. A killer, yes, but one with principles that had cost him everything. A criminal who read poetry and refused to harm innocents. A wanted outlaw who'd spent the night keeping her baby warm and safe. Are they still looking for you? She asked quietly. The law? Always, but dead men don't hunt anybody. Jack met her eyes. I'm the last of the Morrison gang, and I intend to keep it that way. Samuel stirred in Sarah's arms, beginning to fuss with the particular cry that meant he was hungry. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what she needed to do and how little privacy the cave offered. I need to, she began, gesturing helplessly. Jack understood immediately and turned his back, moving to the cave entrance to give her what privacy he could. I'll keep watch, he said simply. As Sarah tended to Samuel, she found herself thinking about the contradiction that was Jack Morrison. Everything about him should have terrified her. The gun on his hip, the casual way he'd mentioned killing 4 men, the fact that helping her put his own freedom at risk. But instead, she felt safer with him than she had since her husband died. Jack, she said when Samuel had settled again, what will you do when the storm ends? Jack turned back around, his expression carefully neutral. What I always do. Keep moving. Stay ahead of the law. Try not to get anyone else hurt in the process. And us? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to address. Jack had saved their lives, but he was still a wanted man with a price on his head. Staying with him meant danger. Leaving him meant facing the world alone with a newborn. "I'll get you to the nearest town," Jack said finally. "Make sure you have enough money to get to your sister in Denver." After that, he shrugged, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "After that, you'll be better off without me." "What if I don't want to be better off without you?" The words were out before Sarah could stop them, hanging in the cave like gun smoke. Jack stared at her in shock, and she felt her face burn with embarrassment and something deeper. "Sarah, you don't know what you're saying. I'm a wanted man. Being around me is dangerous for you and Samuel. More dangerous than being alone in the wilderness with a baby? More dangerous than having no money, no family, no protection?" Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Jack, in one night you've shown me more kindness than I've known since my husband died. You've risked your freedom to save strangers, shared your supplies, kept us alive. If that's what an outlaw looks like, maybe I've been listening to the wrong people about what makes a man good or bad." Jack was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether she meant what she was saying. "You don't understand the life I lead. Always moving, always looking over my shoulder. No home, no stability, no future except what I can steal or fight for." "And you don't understand the life I'm facing," Sarah replied. "A woman alone with a baby, no money, no husband's name to protect me, working whatever jobs I can find, assuming anyone will hire me, probably ending up like your sister, doing whatever I have to do to keep Samuel fed." The comparison hit Jack like a physical blow. The thought of Sarah ending up like Mary, desperate, alone, dying young, made something violent and protective rise in his chest. "There has to be another way," he said roughly. "Maybe there is." Sarah's voice was soft but certain. "Maybe two people with nowhere else to go can figure out where to go together." Outside the cave, the wind had died to a whisper, and pale sunlight was beginning to filter through the entrance. The storm was ending, which meant decision time was approaching fast. Soon they would have to leave the sanctuary and face whatever came next. Jack looked at Sarah holding Samuel, this brave woman who'd survived more hardship in a week than most people faced in a lifetime, and felt something inside him shift permanently. She was offering him something he'd never thought he could have, a chance at redemption, at building something instead of just taking it. It was the most dangerous proposition anyone had ever made to him, and the most tempting. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if we do this, if we try to make this work, there's no going back. Once you're with me, you're with an outlaw. The law will see you as my accomplice. Other criminals will see you as my weakness, and there will always be someone out there looking to settle old scores." Sarah looked down at Samuel, then back at Jack with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "Then I guess we'd better make sure we're worth the risk." 2 days after the storm cleared, Jack was beginning to believe they might actually have a chance. He'd found an abandoned trapper's cabin 5 miles down the mountain. Nothing fancy, but it had 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak, and most importantly, it was far enough from any main trails that they could stay hidden while Sarah recovered her strength and they figured out their next move. Samuel was thriving in the warmer shelter, his cries growing stronger and more demanding each day. Sarah had regained some color in her cheeks and was moving around without the careful, pained steps of someone still healing from childbirth. For the first time since he'd found them in the snow, Jack was allowing himself to think about the future instead of just survival. That's when the past came riding up the mountain to remind him why outlaws didn't get happy endings. Jack was splitting wood outside the cabin when he heard them, the distinctive sound of multiple horses moving through the forest, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. His hands stilled on the axe handle as he counted the hoofbeats. 4 horses, maybe 5, picking their way carefully through the timber. The kind of approach men used when they were hunting something, or someone. Moving with the silent efficiency that had kept him alive for 8 years, Jack set down the axe and slipped back into the cabin. Sarah was sitting by the small fire, nursing Samuel, her face peaceful and relaxed in a way that made Jack's chest tighten with protective fury. "Sarah," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm her, but knowing they were out of time for gentle warnings. "We have company coming up the trail." I need you to take Samuel and get in the root cellar. Now! The peace vanished from Sarah's face, replaced by the sharp alertness of someone who'd learned to recognize danger. She didn't ask questions, just gathered the baby and moved toward the small trapdoor Jack had discovered near the back of the cabin. How many? She whispered as she settled into the cramped space below the floorboards. 4 or 5. Professionals by the sound of it. Jack handed her his spare pistol, a small .32 that would be easier for her to handle. If something happens to me, wait until dark, then take the horse and ride for Denver. Don't stop for anything. Jack, promise me, Sarah. His voice was hard with urgency. Whatever happens, you keep that boy safe. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with fear but her voice steady. I promise. But you come back to us, you hear? We're not done figuring out where we're going together. Jack felt something twist in his chest, hope and terror tangled up so tight he couldn't tell them apart. Yes, ma'am, he said softly. Then close the trapdoor and arrange the worn rug to hide it. Moving to the window, Jack peered through a gap in the shutters and felt his blood turn to ice water. He recognized the lead rider, Cal Stevens, a bounty hunter with a reputation for bringing his quarry back dead more often than alive. Stevens was a thin, hawk-faced man who wore his guns like other men wore jewelry, and he was smart enough to have tracked Jack this far into the wilderness. But it was the man riding beside Stevens that made Jack's hand drift instinctively to his Colt. Marcus Webb had been the territorial marshal's top deputy until he'd been caught taking bribes from cattle thieves. Now he worked the gray area between law and crime, selling his badge to whoever paid best. If Webb was here, it meant someone had put serious money on Jack's head. Morrison, Stevens called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. We know you're in there. Come out peaceful and maybe we can work something out. Jack almost laughed at that. Stevens had never worked anything out peacefully in his life. The bounty hunter was famous for collecting his fees from corpses, easier than dealing with live prisoners who might escape or cause trouble. You boys are a long way from civilization, Jack called back, staying away from the windows. Hope you brought enough supplies for the ride back down. Funny thing about that, Webb replied, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. We heard you might have picked up some traveling companions recently. Woman and a baby, maybe? Folks down in Redemption Creek are mighty worried about them. Jack felt rage flare in his chest. They were using Sarah and Samuel as leverage, threatening innocent people to flush him out. It was exactly the kind of tactic that had driven him to kill his own gang. Don't know what you're talking about, Jack lied smoothly. Been up here alone for weeks. See, that's funny, Stevens said, dismounting and moving closer to the cabin. Because we followed tracks from that old mining shack where someone gave birth recently. Blood in the snow, woman's footprints, baby tracks too small for anything but a newborn. Trail led us right here. Jack cursed silently. He'd been so focused on getting Sarah to safety that he hadn't thought about covering their trail properly. Amateur mistake, and one that might get them all killed. Course, we're reasonable men, Webb continued. Tell you what, Morrison, you come out with your hands up, and we'll make sure the woman and baby get safely back to civilization. Hell, there might even be a reward for rescuing them from a dangerous outlaw. The implication was clear. Surrender or watch innocent people suffer for his choices. It was the kind of moral trap that Jack had spent 8 years learning to navigate, but this time the stakes were higher than his own life. What's the price on my head these days? Jack asked, buying time while he assessed his options. The cabin had 2 exits, the front door and a window in the back that led to a steep drop-off. Neither offered good escape routes with Sarah and Samuel to protect. $5,000, dead or alive, Stevens replied, though I'm thinking dead might be easier for everyone involved. $5,000 was serious money, enough to bring every bounty hunter and gun for hire in the territory running. Someone badly wanted Jack Morrison out of the picture, and they were willing to pay premium prices to make it happen. Who's paying? Jack asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Let's just say you made some powerful enemies when you decided to get religious about innocent folks, Webb said with a laugh that held no humor. Turns out there are people who don't appreciate having their business disrupted by outlaws with sudden attacks of conscience. The railroad. The job Jack had refused to take, the one that would have gotten families killed. Someone connected to that operation was cleaning up loose ends. And Jack Morrison, the outlaw who'd grown a conscience, was apparently loose end number one. Thing is, Stevens continued, moving closer to the cabin, we're not just here for the bounty. We're here because you cost some very important people a lot of money when you decided to play hero. They want to make sure other folks understand what happens when you cross certain lines. Jack felt everything click into place. This wasn't just about capturing a wanted outlaw, it was about sending a message. They weren't planning to take him alive, and they certainly weren't planning to let Sarah and Samuel go free. Dead witnesses couldn't tell stories about who'd really been behind the operation. So here's how this works, Webb called out. You've got exactly 1 minute to come out, or we start burning buildings until we find your friends. Either way, this ends today. Jack looked around the cabin, calculating odds and angles. 4 men, all armed and experienced. He had the advantage of cover and knowing the terrain, but he also had Sarah and Samuel to protect. In a straight fight, he might take 2 of them with him, maybe 3 if he got lucky. But that would still leave at least 1 alive to hurt the people he'd come to love. Because that's what it was, Jack realized with startling clarity. Love. Not just desire or protectiveness, or the natural instinct to help someone in need. He loved Sarah Whitman with a depth and certainty that scared him more than any gun ever had. And he loved little Samuel like the son he'd never thought he'd have, which meant he needed to be smarter than his enemies, not just tougher. Moving quickly but quietly, Jack began preparing for a fight that would either free them all or destroy everything he'd found worth living for. He checked his weapons, the Colt 45 on his hip, a Winchester rifle, and the shotgun he'd taken from a failed bank job 3 years ago. Not much against 4 professional killers, but it would have to do. Time's up, Morrison, Stevens shouted. Last chance to do this easy. Jack moved to the back window and carefully pushed it open. The drop was steep but not impossible, leading down to a thick grove of pine trees that would provide cover. If he could draw them away from the cabin, lead them into the forest, where his knowledge of the terrain would give him an advantage. Sorry, boys, Jack called out, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin walls. But I'm not much for easy. The first gunshot shattered the morning silence, splintering wood near the front door. Jack dove through the back window as more shots erupted, rolling down the steep slope and coming up running. Behind him, he could hear Stevens shouting orders, the sound of boots on wooden floors as they stormed the cabin. He had maybe 30 seconds before they realized the cabin was empty, except for the hidden cellar. 30 seconds to get far enough away to make them follow him instead of searching for Sarah and Samuel. Jack crashed through the pine grove like a man possessed, making as much noise as possible while putting distance between himself and the cabin. Every step took him further from the people he loved, but it also drew the killers away from them. Behind him, angry shouts erupted as the bounty hunters discovered their quarry had escaped. Within moments, Jack could hear them crashing through the forest in pursuit, their horses struggling with the steep terrain and thick underbrush. The hunt was on, and Jack Morrison was running for more than just his own life now. He was running for the chance to keep the promise he'd made to a brave woman in a cave, the promise that they would figure out where to go together. But first, he had to survive long enough to come back to her. Jack had been running through the Colorado wilderness for 20 minutes when he realized his pursuers were making a critical mistake. They were hunting him like he was just another desperate outlaw, instead of a man who'd spent 8 years learning to survive in country that killed unprepared men for sport. The difference was about to cost them everything. Crouched behind a fallen pine log, Jack caught his breath and listened to the sounds of pursuit crashing through the forest below him. Stevens and his men were staying together, probably afraid of being picked off individually if they spread out. Smart thinking against most fugitives, but Jack wasn't most fugitives. He was a man fighting for his family. The thought still surprised him. Family. 3 days ago, he'd been a lone wolf with nothing to lose but his own worthless life. Now he had Sarah and Samuel counting on him to come back alive. And that knowledge transformed everything about how he approached this deadly game of cat and mouse. Moving with the silent efficiency that had made him legendary, Jack began working his way higher up the mountainside, using game trails and rock formations that would be invisible to men on horseback. Every step took him further from the cabin, which was exactly what he wanted. The longer he kept them chasing shadows, the more time Sarah had to escape if something went wrong. "Morrison!" Stephen's voice echoed through the trees, frustration clear in every syllable. "You can run all you want, but we know these mountains too. You're just postponing the inevitable." Jack smiled grimly at that. Stevens might know the general area, but Jack had spent the last month learning every deer path, every hidden ravine, every cave and outcropping in this section of the Rockies. This was his territory now, and he was about to teach 4 overconfident bounty hunters what that meant. The first lesson came 15 minutes later. Jack had positioned himself on a narrow ledge overlooking the trail his pursuers were following, the Winchester rifle steady against his shoulder. He wasn't planning to kill, not yet, but he needed to thin the odds and break up their formation. When Marcus Webb rode into view below, his corrupt marshal's badge still pinned to his coat like a mockery of justice, Jack put a bullet through the man's hat brim. Webb's horse reared in terror, dumping the crooked lawman into a patch of thorny undergrowth, while the animal bolted back down the trail. "Son of a bitch!" Webb roared, thrashing around in the bushes while his companions struggled to control their own spooked mounts. "Spread out," Stevens ordered. "He's up high somewhere, picking at us like a goddamn sniper." But spreading out was exactly what Jack wanted them to do. Divided, they'd be vulnerable to the kind of guerrilla tactics he learned during the war: hit fast, disappear, hit again from a different angle. Make them afraid of shadows and jumping at every sound. Jack was already moving before they could pinpoint his position, flowing through the forest like smoke. Behind him, he could hear the bounty hunters shouting conflicting orders, their coordination falling apart under the stress of being hunted instead of hunting. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Sarah was facing her own kind of hell. Crammed into the root cellar, with Samuel pressed against her chest, she could hear everything: the gunshots, the shouted threats, the sound of boots stomping across the floor above her head as the killers searched for any sign of their quarry's companions. "Nothing here but old supplies," one of them called out. "Maybe Morrison was telling the truth about being alone." "Bullshit," another voice replied. Webb, though he sounded like he was speaking through gritted teeth. "I can smell woman in this place. Milk and baby powder and soap? They're here somewhere. Or they were recently." Sarah held her breath, pressing her hand gently over Samuel's mouth to keep him quiet. The baby seemed to sense the danger, his eyes wide and alert, but mercifully silent. "Check for hidden spaces," Webb continued. "Loose floorboards, false walls, anything that could hide people." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps moved directly overhead. Through the thin gap between floorboards, she could see slivers of light and shadow as the men searched. One of them was standing almost directly above the trap door, close enough that she could have reached up and touched his boot. Samuel began to squirm, working up to what Sarah recognized as his hungry cry. In a few seconds, he would start wailing loud enough to wake the dead and bring the killers down on top of them. Moving with desperate efficiency, Sarah shifted position and began nursing the baby, praying the warmth and comfort would keep him quiet long enough for the search to move on. Samuel latched on eagerly, his tiny hands gripping her dress as he settled into the rhythm of feeding. Above them, the footsteps paused. "You hear something?" one of the men asked. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Even muffled by the floorboards, was Samuel's feeding making enough noise to give them away? "Just mice," Webb said after a moment that lasted forever. "Place is probably full of them. Let's check the back room." The footsteps moved away, but Sarah knew their reprieve was temporary. These men were thorough, and eventually they would find the hidden cellar. When they did, she needed to be ready. Moving carefully in the cramped space, Sarah checked the small pistol Jack had given her. She'd never killed anyone in her life, had barely even held a gun before today. But looking down at Samuel's innocent face, she knew she would do whatever it took to protect him, even if it meant becoming someone she'd never imagined she could be. High up on the mountainside, Jack was conducting a master class in frontier warfare. Using the terrain to his advantage, he'd managed to separate the bounty hunters into 2 groups, Stevens and one other man working their way up the eastern slope, while Webb and the 4th killer tried to circle around from the west. The divided approach made them easier targets, but it also meant Jack had to be in 2 places at once. Every minute he spent harassing one group was a minute the other could use to double back toward the cabin. Time was running out. Jack made his decision with the cold calculation of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts above all else. Instead of continuing to play defense, he was going to take the fight directly to his enemies. Moving like a ghost through the pine forest, Jack positioned himself above the western approach where Webb and his partner were struggling up a rocky slope. The corrupt marshal was favoring his left leg, probably twisted it when his horse threw him, and his companion was breathing hard from the altitude and exertion. Perfect targets. Jack waited until they were directly below him, then rolled a loose boulder down the slope. The rock gathered momentum as it bounced and tumbled, forcing both men to dive for cover as it crashed past them. In the confusion, Jack emerged from the tree line with his Colt drawn. "Drop your weapons," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Webb's companion, a young gun hand with more swagger than sense, went for his pistol instead of surrendering. Jack's bullet took him center mass, dropping him like a stone before his weapon had even cleared leather. Webb was smarter. He raised his hands, but his eyes held the calculating look of a man waiting for an opportunity. "Jack Morrison," he said with false calm, "should have known you'd turn this into a war instead of just coming quietly." "Should have known better than to threaten innocent people," Jack replied, moving closer but staying out of grabbing range. "Where's Stevens?" "Close enough," Webb said with a cold smile. "Close enough to hear that gunshot and know exactly where you are." As if summoned by his words, rifle fire erupted from the slope above them. Bullets whined off the rocks around Jack's position, forcing him to dive for cover as Stevens and his remaining partner opened up with everything they had. Webb used the distraction to roll behind a boulder, coming up with a hideout gun that he'd apparently had tucked in his boot. Jack saw the movement and fired, but the corrupt marshal was already moving, the bullets sparking off granite instead of flesh. Now it was a three-way gunfight on a mountainside, with Jack caught in the middle and his enemies holding the high ground. But Jack Morrison hadn't survived 8 years as an outlaw by giving up when the odds turned bad. Rolling behind his own cover, he began working his way upslope, using the terrain and his intimate knowledge of the area to close the distance with Stevens. What happened next would determine whether he lived to see Sarah and Samuel again, or whether three people who'd found love in the wilderness would be torn apart by ghosts from a violent past. Behind one boulder, Marcus Webb checked his weapon and smiled. The outlaw was trapped between them now, and $5,000 was about to be a lot easier to collect. Above them, Cal Stevens settled his rifle against a steady rest and began looking for a clear shot at the man who'd caused him so much trouble. And somewhere in between, Jack Morrison prepared to fight the most important battle of his life, not for money or revenge or even survival, but for the right to build something better than the violent legacy he was trying to leave behind. The mountain was about to run red with blood, and only one side was walking away alive. The gunfight that would determine Jack Morrison's fate lasted exactly 7 minutes, but each second stretched like an eternity. Pinned between Webb below and Stevens above, Jack found himself in the kind of tactical nightmare that had killed countless men in the wilderness, caught in crossfire with limited cover and nowhere to run. But Jack Morrison wasn't just any man. He was a father fighting for his family, and that made all the difference. Using a technique he'd learned during a particularly vicious skirmish outside Gettysburg, Jack began moving in a zigzag pattern up the slope, never staying in one position long enough for either shooter to draw a proper bead. Bullets whined past his head and sparked off the granite around him, but he kept climbing, kept closing the distance with Stevens. "He's like a damn mountain goat," Stevens cursed, levering another round into his Winchester. "How the hell is he moving that fast uphill?" The answer was simple. Jack Morrison was running on something stronger than adrenaline. He was running on love, and the desperate need to get back to the woman and child who'd given his life meaning. 50 yards from Stevens' position, Jack spotted what he'd been looking for, a narrow chimney in the rock face that would allow him to get above his enemy's position. It was a dangerous climb, exposed to gunfire for several crucial seconds, but it was his only chance to turn the tables. Jack made his move just as Webb fired from below, the bullet tugging at his coat sleeve as he dove for the rock chimney. Pain flared along his ribs where another shot had come too close. but he kept climbing, using handholds that would have challenged a professional mountaineer. "Where the hell did he go?" Stephen shouted, scanning the slope frantically. The answer came in the form of Jack Morrison appearing like an avenging angel on the rocks above them, his Colt 45 steady in his hand. "Right here," Jack said quietly. Stephen spun around, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but Jack's first bullet took him center mass. The bounty hunter dropped his weapon and staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered by his quarry. "Should have stayed in civilization," Jack said, and put a second bullet in Stevens's heart. The remaining hunter, a nervous kid who couldn't have been more than 20, threw down his gun and raised his hands. "Don't shoot! I surrender! I was just here for the money. I didn't know about the woman and baby." Jack studied the young man's face, seeing genuine terror and regret there. "What's your name, son?" Billy Crawford." "Look, mister, I never killed nobody before. Steven said this was just a simple bounty collection. I swear I didn't know you had a family to protect." "Billy Crawford," Jack repeated, keeping his gun trained on the young bounty hunter. "You're going to ride out of these mountains and never come back. You're going to forget you ever heard the name Jack Morrison. And if I ever see you hunting innocent people again, I'll kill you. Are we clear?" Billy nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. Crystal clear. I'm done with bounty hunting. I swear it." "Then get out of here before I change my mind." As Billy scrambled down the mountainside toward his horse, Jack turned his attention to the more dangerous problem. Marcus Webb was still alive somewhere below, and the corrupt marshal was far too smart to give up easily. The silence that followed was more ominous than any gunfire. Webb was planning something, and Jack needed to end this before the man tried to circle back toward the cabin. Moving carefully down the slope, Jack used every scrap of cover available, his senses alert for any sign of movement. He found Webb's position empty except for a few drops of blood on the granite. Jack's earlier shot had winged him, but not enough to stop a determined man. Following the blood trail, Jack realized with growing dread where the corrupt marshal was heading. Back toward the cabin, back toward Sarah and Samuel. Jack abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through the forest with the desperation of a man who'd found everything worth living for and was about to lose it. Behind him, smoke was beginning to rise from the direction of the cabin. Webb was trying to burn them out. At the cabin, Sarah's worst fears were coming true. She'd heard the gunshots from the mountain, the sudden silence that followed, and then the sound of a single horse approaching at a gallop. Now she could smell smoke, and she could hear Marcus Webb's voice calling out with the false authority of his tarnished badge. "Mrs. Whitman, I know you're in there. Your outlaw friend is dead, shot down like the dog he was. But I'm a reasonable man. Come out now with the baby, and I'll see you get safely back to civilization." Sarah clutched Samuel tighter, her heart breaking at the thought that Jack might really be dead. But even through her grief, she could hear the lie in Webb's voice. This man wasn't here to rescue anyone. He was here to eliminate witnesses. "I've got kerosene and matches, lady," Webb continued. "You can come out easy, or you can burn to death in there. Your choice." The smell of smoke grew stronger, and Sarah could see orange light beginning to flicker through the gaps in the floorboards above her. Webb was making good on his threat, and the cabin was starting to burn. Samuel began to cry, sensing his mother's terror, and Sarah knew their hiding place was about to become their tomb unless she acted. Moving carefully in the cramped cellar, she checked Jack's pistol one more time, then kissed Samuel's forehead. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "Mama's got to do something very brave now." Sarah Whitman had never killed anyone in her life, but she was about to become a killer to protect her child. Pushing open the trap door just enough to see out, Sarah spotted Webb standing near the front of the cabin, a can of kerosene in one hand and a lit torch in the other. His back was partially turned to her position, and he was focused on the spreading flames. Sarah lifted the pistol with both hands the way Jack had shown her and took careful aim. The gun felt impossibly heavy, but her hands were steady with maternal fury. "Hey!" she called out. Webb spun around, his face lighting up with triumph as he spotted her emerging from the hidden cellar. Well, well, the grieving widow finally decides to. Sarah's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the torch flying into the snow. Webb cursed and reached for his own weapon, But Sarah was already moving, scrambling out of the cellar with Samuel clutched against her chest. "You killed him!" she screamed, advancing on the wounded marshal with the pistol raised. "You killed the only good man I ever knew!" Webb brought his gun up, but he was wounded and off balance. Sarah's second shot caught him in the chest, dropping him to his knees in the snow that was rapidly turning red beneath him. "Should have minded your own business," Webb gasped, blood foaming on his lips. "Should have stayed away from outlaws." "He wasn't just an outlaw," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "He was a good man. A better man than you'll ever be." Webb tried to say something else, but death took him before the words could form. Sarah stood over his body, the smoking pistol in her hand, when she heard the sound of running footsteps. She spun around, raising the weapon again, then nearly collapsed with relief as Jack burst into the clearing. He was alive, wounded. She could see blood on his shirt, but alive and running toward her with an expression of such desperate relief that it took her breath away. "Sarah!" Jack swept her and Samuel into his arms, holding them so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought I'd lost you. When I saw the smoke, I thought you were dead," Sarah sobbed against his chest. "He said he'd killed you. I thought I was alone again." "Never," Jack said fiercely, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll never leave you alone again. I promise you that." Looking over her shoulder at Webb's body, Jack felt a grim satisfaction. The corrupt marshal had gotten exactly what he deserved. But more importantly, Sarah had proven she could protect herself and Samuel when it mattered most. "You did good," he told her, gently taking the pistol from her shaking hands. "You did what you had to do to protect our son." Our son. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning and promise. Samuel wasn't just Sarah's baby anymore. He was their child, the beginning of the family they were building together. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, looking around the burning cabin that had been their temporary refuge. Jack nodded, his arm tightening around her. "It's over. Stevens is dead, Webb's dead, and I let the kid go with a warning he won't soon forget. We're free, Sarah. Free to go wherever we want, be whoever we want to be." As the cabin burned behind them, destroying the last evidence of their time in hiding, Jack and Sarah stood together in the snow with Samuel between them. They'd survived the worst that their enemies could throw at them, and they'd done it together. The outlaws' redemption was complete, but their story was just beginning. "So where do we go now?" Sarah asked, watching the flames consume the walls that had sheltered them. Jack looked at the woman who'd given him a reason to be better than he'd ever thought possible, at the child who'd made him a father, at the vast wilderness stretching out before them, full of endless possibilities. "Wherever you want," he said simply, "as long as we go together." And together they walked into their future, leaving the ghosts of Jack Morrison's violent past burning in the Colorado mountains behind them. 6 months later, the small ranch house sat in a valley so green and peaceful, it seemed like something from a dream. Wildflowers dotted the meadows where Jack's horses grazed, and the sound of running water from the creek that bordered their property provided a constant, soothing backdrop to their new life. Sarah stood on the front porch, watching Jack work with a young colt in the corral, his movements patient and gentle as he earned the animal's trust. It was hard to believe this was the same man who'd once been one of the most feared outlaws in Colorado territory. These days, Jack Morrison was known throughout the valley as a fair horse trader and a devoted family man. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. "Papa!" Samuel called out from his position on the porch rail, his chubby arms reaching toward the man who'd become his father in every way that mattered. At 8 months old, Samuel was already showing signs of the stubborn determination that seemed to run in his chosen family. Jack looked up from his work with the colt, his face lighting up with the kind of joy Sarah had never thought she'd see in those weather-beaten features. "Hey there, little man. You watching me work?" Samuel babbled something that might have been an attempt at horse and clapped his hands in delight. Jack's smile widened, and Sarah felt her heart do that little flutter it always did when she watched the two most important people in her life together. They'd been through so much to get here. After leaving the burned cabin in the mountains, they traveled south to New Mexico territory, where Jack's reputation was less well known, and they could start fresh. He'd used the last of his outlaw savings to buy this small spread. Nothing fancy, but enough land to raise horses and provide a good life for his family. The first few months had been challenging. Jack struggled with the guilt of his violent past, sometimes waking in the night from dreams of the men he'd killed. Sarah had nightmares about Marcus Webb and the moment she'd pulled the trigger to save her son's life. But they'd faced those demons together, and slowly the healing had begun. "Mama, look!" Samuel pointed excitedly as Jack led the now calm colt around the corral. The animal had accepted the halter and was walking peacefully beside the man who'd once made his living taking things that didn't belong to him. "I see, sweetheart," Sarah said, settling into the rocking chair Jack had built for her. "Papa's very good with horses, isn't he?" Papa, the word still sent a warm glow through Sarah's chest. Jack had never asked Samuel to call him that. It had happened naturally as the baby grew and began to understand that this strong, gentle man was the one who fed him, played with him, and sang him to sleep with surprisingly tender lullabies. The legal adoption would be finalized next month when the circuit judge made his rounds through their part of New Mexico. Jack Morrison would officially become Samuel Morrison, though in their hearts he'd been their son since that first night in the cave. "Mrs. Morrison?" a voice called from the front gate. Sarah looked up to see Martha Henderson, their nearest neighbor, approaching with a covered dish in her hands. Sarah still felt a little thrill every time someone called her by her new name. She and Jack had been married by the territorial magistrate 3 months ago, in a simple ceremony with Samuel on her hip and half the valley in attendance. It hadn't been the grand wedding she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it had been perfect. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, promising to build a life together. "Good afternoon, Martha," Sarah called back. "What brings you by?" Martha Henderson was a practical woman in her 50s who'd taken Sarah under her wing from the moment they'd arrived in the valley. She had strong opinions about everything from child rearing to horse training, but her heart was pure gold. "Brought you some of my apple preserves," Martha said, climbing the porch steps with the vigor of someone half her age. "And I wanted to check on this little one." She made faces at Samuel, who gurgled with laughter and reached for her with sticky fingers. "You spoil him terribly," Sarah said, but she was smiling. After months of isolation and danger, having neighbors who cared about their family felt like a luxury beyond measure. "Someone has to," Martha replied, settling Samuel on her lap with practiced ease. "Boy needs grandparents, and since his real ones aren't around to do the job, Fred and I figure we'll have to step in." The casual assumption that they belonged, that Samuel had a place in this community, still caught Sarah by surprise sometimes. In her old life, she'd been the poor widow struggling to survive. Here she was Mrs. Morrison, respected member of the community, wife of the man who'd helped their neighbor find his stolen cattle and never asked for payment beyond a home-cooked meal. "Speaking of Fred," Martha continued, "he wanted me to ask Jack about breaking that new stallion of his. That animal's got the devil in him, but Fred thinks your husband might be the only man in the territory with the patience to gentle him properly." "I'll ask him," Sarah promised. Jack had developed a reputation for being able to work with horses that other men had given up on as hopeless. There was something about his gentle persistence that reached even the most traumatized animals, probably because he understood what it was like to be considered dangerous and unredeemable. As if summoned by their conversation, Jack finished with the colt and walked toward the house, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. The gun was still on his hip. Old habits died hard, and there were still occasional rumors of his past catching up with him. But these days it was a tool rather than an extension of his identity. "Ladies," Jack said, tipping his hat to Martha with the kind of natural courtesy that had won over the entire valley. "Samuel behaving himself for you, Mrs. Henderson." "This angel?" Martha bounced the baby on her knee, earning another delighted giggle. "He's perfect, just like his parents." Jack and Sarah exchanged a look over Martha's head, a moment of shared amazement that they'd somehow fooled everyone into thinking they were respectable people. But maybe that was the point. Maybe becoming respectable wasn't about erasing your past, but about choosing who you wanted to be going forward. "Martha brought preserves," Sarah said, "and Fred wants to know if you'll work with his stallion." Tell Fred I'd be happy to take a look, Jack replied, settling onto the porch rail beside Samuel's chair. Though from what I hear, that horse has some serious trust issues. Takes one to know one, Martha said with a knowing look that made both Jack and Sarah freeze. For a moment, Sarah wondered if their cover had been blown, if somehow their neighbor had figured out that the quiet horse trader was actually Jack Raven Morrison, wanted outlaw. But Martha's next words put her fears to rest. Fred was the same way when I met him, all walls and suspicion, sure that anyone who showed him kindness had an ulterior motive. Took me 2 years to convince him I wasn't going anywhere. Martha smiled fondly. Some of the best men are the hardest to gentle. They're worth the effort, though. As Martha prepared to leave, she handed Samuel back to Sarah and fixed Jack with a serious look. You know, there's talk in town about making you sheriff when old Peterson retires next year. Jack nearly choked on the coffee he'd been sipping. Ma'am, you're good with people. You understand horses and tracking, and you've got that way about you that makes troublemakers think twice about causing problems. Martha nodded approvingly. Of course, we'd need to know more about your background, but character references from this valley would carry a lot of weight with the territorial authorities. After Martha left, Jack and Sarah sat in a stunned silence for several minutes. Sheriff. The irony was almost too much to process, the outlaw becoming the lawman, the hunter becoming the protector. What do you think? Jack asked finally. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing not the dangerous criminal he'd once been, but the man who read bedtime stories to Samuel every night, who helped elderly neighbors with their chores, who'd built them a life based on honesty and hard work. I think, she said slowly, that you'd make a better sheriff than most men who've worn the badge. You understand what drives people to break the law, which means you'd know how to stop them without just shooting first and asking questions later. Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching Samuel play with his wooden blocks on the porch floor. Would you be okay with it? The danger, I mean. There's always risk in law enforcement. Sarah reached over and took his hand. Jack Morrison, I fell in love with you when you were one of the most wanted men in the territory. A little danger from the job isn't going to scare me away now. That evening, as they sat together after putting Samuel to bed, Jack and Sarah talked about the future in a way they'd never dared before. For months, they'd been focused on simply surviving, on building something stable and safe. Now, for the first time, they could dream about what came next. Sheriff Morrison, Sarah said experimentally, it has a nice ring to it. Former outlaw turned lawman, Jack mused. Think the irony might be lost on most people. The best kind of justice comes from understanding both sides, Sarah said. You've been both the criminal and the victim. You know what it feels like to be desperate enough to break the law, and you know what it costs when someone you love gets hurt by violence. Jack pulled her closer on the porch swing he'd built, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at how completely his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a man with no future, no hope, nothing but a reputation for violence and a past he couldn't escape. Now he had everything he'd never dared to dream of. A wife who loved him, a son who called him Papa, a community that respected him, and the possibility of a future where he could use his hard-won experience to protect instead of destroy. Sarah, he said quietly, do you ever regret it? Choosing this life with me instead of going to your sister in Denver? Living a normal life? Sarah smiled and kissed his cheek. Jack Morrison, you gave me the most extraordinary life I could have imagined. Adventure, love, a family, and a future full of possibilities. Why would I regret choosing extraordinary over ordinary? As the stars came out over their valley, Jack and Sarah Morrison sat together on their porch, planning their future, and marveling at how far they'd come from that desperate night in a cave when an outlaw saved a stranger's life and found his own redemption in the process. The past was behind them. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise, and they would face it together, the way they'd faced everything else, with love, courage, and the unshakable belief that sometimes the best people are the ones who fought hardest to become worthy of the second chances they've been given. And so ends the incredible true story of Jack Raven Morrison and Sarah Whitman. A tale that proves love truly can conquer even the darkest past, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to fight for it. History would remember Jack Morrison not as the outlaw he once was, but as Sheriff Morrison, a lawman who brought a unique understanding of justice to the New Mexico territory. His approach to law enforcement, informed by his own experience on both sides of the legal divide, became legendary throughout the Southwest. He never drew his gun unless absolutely necessary, preferring to talk troublemakers down rather than shoot them down. Many said it was because he understood what drove men to desperation, having walked that dark path himself. Sarah Morrison became one of the most respected women in their valley, known for her fierce protection of her family and her willingness to help any woman in need. She established the first school in their county and taught children to read using the same gentle patience Jack showed with wild horses. Those who knew her story, and there were few, said she proved that sometimes the strongest people are those who've been broken and chose to heal rather than become bitter. Samuel Morrison grew up to become a federal judge, carrying forward the principles his adoptive father had learned through hard experience. That justice without mercy is just revenge, and that every person deserves a chance to prove they can be better than their worst moment. He often said his greatest inheritance wasn't property or money, but the example of a man who'd chosen love over violence and built a family from the ashes of his former life. The story of their love spread throughout the frontier territories, becoming the kind of legend that cowboys told around campfires and mothers shared with their daughters. It was a story about second chances and the courage to choose hope over despair, about the difference between the law and justice, and why sometimes breaking the rules is the most moral thing you can do. But perhaps most importantly, it was a story about the transformative power of love. Not just romantic love, but the love of family, community, and the belief that people can change. Jack Morrison's wanted posters were quietly removed from sheriff's offices across Colorado territory when he was sworn in as a lawman himself. The federal marshals who'd once hunted him became his colleagues, respecting the man he'd become while never quite forgetting the outlaw he'd been. Some said it was the perfect example of how the Wild West could reform even its most notorious citizens. Their ranch still stands today, now operated by Samuel's great-grandchildren who carry the Morrison name with pride. Visitors can still see the original cabin Jack built for his family and the corral where he gentled horses that others had given up as hopeless. A bronze plaque by the front gate reads simply, "Home of Sheriff Jack Morrison," proof that it's never too late to choose who you want to be. This is the legacy of the American frontier, not just the violence and lawlessness that filled the history books, but the quiet stories of ordinary people who chose extraordinary love in impossible circumstances. Stories of outlaws who became heroes, widows who became pioneers, and babies who grew up to change the world because someone chose to save them instead of abandon them. If this story moved you, remember that every day offers us the same choice Jack Morrison faced in that Colorado cave. We can walk away from people in need, or we can choose to be the help that someone desperately requires. We can let our past define our future, or we can write a new story with our actions and choices. The frontier may be gone, but the opportunity for redemption, for love that conquers fear, for families built on choice rather than blood, that opportunity exists every day, in every place where human hearts are brave enough to risk everything for the chance at something better. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of love, redemption, and the untamed American frontier. Like this video if Jack and Sarah's journey touched your heart. Comment below. Do you believe people can truly change? What would you have done in Jack's position? Coming next, the schoolmarm who tamed the Devil's Canyon Gang, a teacher's courage. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Colorado mountains and New Mexico valleys, where an outlaw found his redemption and a widow found her strength. Remember, it's never too late to choose who you want to be.